Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming and for staying for the last and final panel of the day. My name is Reika Nair, and I am also one of the Toll Public Interest Scholars of the class of 2012. This panel this afternoon is entitled In Search of Shelter, Local and National Strategies for Alleviating Homelessness. I'm very lucky, and we are all very lucky to have these 5 very distinguished panelists here with us. I'm just going to briefly introduce them, but I encourage you to look in your program for their extensive background and to see the incredible work that they each do. To my direct left here is Ms. Farah Jimenez. She is president and CEO of the People's Emergency Center, and she's also a Penn Law alum. Sitting to her left is Dr. Edward Speedling. He is the manager of a homeless veterans internship program at Project Home. Following him is Professor Dennis Culhane. He is a professor here at the University of Pennsylvania and the director of research for the National Center for Homelessness Among Veterans. To his left is Dr. Ralph de Costa Nunez. He is president of the Institute for Children, Poverty, and Homelessness, and one of his assistants is passing out some documents for all of you. And then finally, at the end of the table is Miss Nikki Johnson-Houston. She is formerly homeless and currently an attorney for the City of Philadelphia Law Department. With that, we're going to go ahead and get started. And we're going to start with you, Ms. Johnson-Houston. If you've had a very personal connection to today's issue. If you could briefly tell us a little bit about your experience and what you believe are the key interventions which are necessary to end homelessness.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me today. What I would say is I don't have the background of your typical attorney. I was homeless as a child along with my mother and brother in San Diego, California. We went from shelters, people's couches, park benches sometimes if we were too late to get into a shelter. We ate at kitchens, food kitchens, and missions. One of the difficulties that we had along the way was during that time, and this is about 25 years ago, was there was not a lot put in place for homeless women and children. So what would happen is we would go into a shelter at about 5 o'clock. We'd have a place to sleep overnight. We'd have to take our belongings with us during the day. And because there was no child care, although they encouraged my mother to look for jobs, she couldn't do it because she had children, and we would spend our days in the library. For me, that actually ended up being something wonderful because I got a love of reading, and I think that has absolutely helped me along the way. Unfortunately, after a year of us being homeless, my mother just decided it was just something that she couldn't do and that she couldn't keep us together as a family. We were separated. I was sent to live with my disabled grandmother who was living in Section 8 housing for senior citizens, so actually she had to hide me until she could get placement in a place that would take both of us. My brother was sent into foster care and bounced around for many years, and my mother continued her difficulties with drug and alcohol. I'm proud to say that as of today, she is drug and alcohol free. After I went to go live with my grandmother, she didn't have a lot of resources, but obviously that was a much more stable environment than what I was being raised in with my mother. I got a scholarship to come out to Philadelphia to St. Joseph's University. After a year, I had a lot of difficulties and I failed out. I got a job as a live-in nanny on the main line for a family of lawyers, and they encouraged me to go back to school, which is what I did. And I went back to St. Joe's in their night school program, and I graduated in 1998 with a bachelor's degree. I went on to Temple Law School, and I was one of the first people in the history of the law school to graduate with a JD, MBA, LLM, and tax at the same time in 4 years. And so I've been very lucky. I have a great job with the city. And one of the things that I do is I come out and I tell my story, because for a lot of people, they think that homeless people are people who don't want to work, people who are lazy, people who have mental illness or have drug and alcohol problems, and that is part of the population. But there are many people that are nameless and faceless that are children that are being left behind, and I want people to see what someone who's been given some opportunities can achieve. While I've had a happy ending to my story, I can't tell you my story without telling you my brother's story. And my brother's story is that, as I mentioned, he went to foster care, he went into boys' homes, he dropped out of high school at about 16 years old. He got involved with drugs and found out that he was HIV positive. He dealt with homelessness for the majority of his life, and in court, he was in court-ordered rehab this summer, and he took his own life because he just never could deal with the impact of homelessness and his drug addiction. And so I know that I'm very lucky, and that for every story like mine, there's stories like my brother. One of the reasons that I think I was lucky is because of the love and support of my grandmother, but also because of the resources that I found in welfare, in my schools, at college, and I was open to that, and I think that's one of the reasons why. My brother did not have the same opportunities, and so I want people to remember that we're talking about real people here, and that even if someone, it's a moral issue as far as I'm concerned, even if someone doesn't want to work, or even if someone does have drug or alcohol problems, even if someone makes a mistake, does that mean they don't deserve to have a place to live, or food to eat, or the opportunity to have the American dream? Because I've been lucky enough to have that.
Before we move on, before we move on to the next speaker, I just wanted to know if you could maybe tell us what you thought were the key initiatives or key things that happened for you that enabled you to be so successful.
I mean, I would say that I think it's support. I think that, honestly, I didn't let the label of homelessness stop me. But the truth is that there is a lot of shame that is attached to being homeless. And I had difficulties with that growing up, to be honest. When you're a kid, you want to be like everyone else. I think that there are organizations now that weren't in place sort of at the time when I was a kid that are sort of aware of this and give the mental health support that is needed, that gives job training support that's needed. But the reality was, you know, I had difficulties along the way. It wasn't perfect. I mean, I failed out of school, and I think that happens to a fair amount of people that are coming from poverty, because you're the first person in your family. And although my grandmother encouraged me to go to college, she didn't really understand what that meant. She didn't understand about financial aid or any sort of the practical matters. You know, I like to say it was my grandmother, it was God, and it was luck.
Thank you for that very realistic and personal perspective. I think a panelist in the panel before this says it really helps. The important thing is to cut through the indifference, and I think your story helps all of us try and do that. And in an effort to cut through the indifference, I know there has been a national push to address homelessness, and Professor Culhane, your work has been very influential in changing homelessness policy nationally. I was wondering if you could tell us what you see as the key successes and perhaps shortcomings of the recent and evolving federal legislation.
Sure, thank you. That was a very humbling and a testimonial, and really appreciated hearing the story. You know, we've had a lot of experience with the homelessness problem over the last 25 years, and unfortunately, a lot of the stories you hear don't end as happily as the one we just heard, and there has been a lot of mistakes made, but there's also been a lot of very positive lessons learned. There's been research that's been done. The various federal agencies involved in funding homelessness have supported research into what are the evidence-based practices, what are the things that work and what doesn't. And all of that has evolved over the last 20 years into little tiny changes to the main federal homelessness program, which is called the McKinney Act. And the McKinney Act was authorized for the first time in 1987. It had a slight reauthorization in 1992, but it wasn't until just 2009 early in the Obama administration that there was a substantial change to the way the McKinney Act is going to operate. So we're still waiting for the final regulations to come from HUD regarding how that's going to be implemented, but I do want to note a few of the important changes that it is going to institutionalize, and I think for the better. One is with regard to the single adult homeless population, there has been an evolving understanding that within that population there is a group who are sometimes called chronically homeless, or people who experience very long-term homelessness. They're in and out of shelters, in and out of the streets, cycling through emergency rooms, and they get arrested frequently, so they'll spend time in jail. They may be hospitalized. Nearly all of these folks have some kind of significant disability, oftentimes a behavioral health-related disability, whether it be a mental illness or a substance use issue. And these folks are unable to get out of homelessness on their own. They only represent about 10 to 15% of the single adult population that becomes homeless over the course of a year or two. But nevertheless, they're very significant and visible, and on a given day, they account for about 50 to 60% of the single adult, and probably most of the visible homeless who we often recognize. There has evolved a very effective intervention for this population, and it's called permanent supportive housing. You sometimes will hear the slogan "Housing First" associated with these programs. The idea being that what we've learned is that a lot of these are folks who it's unreasonable to expect them to go into a recovery program and become substance-free, or go into a mental health program and get treatment and get medicated and then get into the housing. These are folks who have failed repeatedly, many times dozens, and maybe even 100 times in various recovery efforts. So what has been learned is that to take a different perspective, which is provide them with housing and stabilization first, and the support services that they need to stay in that housing and to engage in recovery and in treatment over time. And this is in contrast to what had been tried before, which was approaches that talked about housing readiness. The assumption being that these folks weren't ready for housing. They had to go through a bunch of programs to be made housing ready. And so we've learned that these Housing First programs are very effective. For many of the populations, they're actually cost effective as well, insofar as the return on the investment in terms of reduced hospitalizations, reduced incarcerations, actually means that the intervention costs less to the taxpayer than having a person continue to be homeless. And for about 35% of the chronic homeless, that is the case. It's actually a net benefit to the taxpayer to have these folks placed in housing. So that's been a very important innovation. About 80,000 units were developed under the Bush administration and into the Obama administration under a special initiative. And that has now been institutionalized in the law, and we expect to see that that will remain a major priority under the Hearth Act, that there will be more of these. There's actually a campaign called the 100,000 Homes Campaign that you could find. There's a website for that, where communities have signed up to try to collectively across the country develop 100,000 homes, because we estimate that about 115,000 people are chronically homeless in the United States. And 115,000 is not a huge number in a country of 300 million people. And certainly we think it's in our reach to really solve and end homelessness for that population over the next 5 years. The federal plan calls for trying to do 100,000 units over the next 5 years. A second major thrust in the Hearth Act, the new McKinney Act legislation, is focused on homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing. The homeless family population is also surprisingly relatively small, given the scope of poverty and family and child poverty in the United States. Families and children are actually underrepresented in the homeless population relative to poverty. About 85,000 families are homeless in the United States on any given night. And so again, it's something we think can be solved, and there have been a number of very effective programs which use the same concept of housing first. The idea that get families into the housing as quickly as possible, because what happens is in a lot of communities, most of the resources are spent to maintain people in shelters, maintain them in a state of homelessness, rather than using those resources to solve their homelessness more directly. So the new thrust in the federal legislation is that no family should be homeless more than 30 days. The funding for homeless programs for communities is going to incentivize getting the average length of stay less than 20 days for families. Communities will be rewarded for being effective at trying to get families out of homelessness as quickly as possible and back into the housing units with the appropriate supports. And effectively what this means is they get temporary rental assistance, and with the expectation that substantial numbers of these folks will be able to, through the appropriate supports, get into employment. But also recognizing that there will be some of these folks for whom the expectation of self-sufficiency isn't going to be realized, and they're going to have a subsidy that will be necessary to sustain them in their housing. But the goal is to get them into housing. And I'll leave it there. We'll maybe pick up more with question and answers. Thanks.
Well, thank you for that overview of some of the key initiatives in the new federal legislation. I think the federal legislation is always sort of one thing on paper and then a different thing when it comes to on the local level and direct service providers. So Farah, I was hoping you could kind of give us a direct service provider perspective as to how the recent federal legislation and federal attention has changed the practice of service providers like People's Emergency Center.
Well, I'll start by just saying a little bit about the People's Emergency Center. And one thing you should know is that while I've been in the nonprofit world, and I actually began my career in homeless services while an undergraduate here at Penn running a soup kitchen, I've been away from the field for 13 years and just started as president CEO of PEC in the last 6 months. So I'm hardly quite a versed expert with some of this federal legislation, but I'm going to give you a general insight into what it's meant for our organization and generally the field. First of all, the People's Emergency Center was established in 1972 as a program to serve homeless families, and specifically through quality emergency housing. And for PEC, that meant we were providing shelter housing in the form of group dorms where we would have between 2, and we still do, between 2 to 6 families in a dorm, not what you usually think of in terms of a shelter, which is one vast space filled with lots of families. But instead it was giving some semblance of privacy, but still a pretty open environment overall. There'll be multiple beds in those dorms, some storage furnishings, but in addition, they would come out and eat their 3 square meals in a group kitchen, a group dining room experience. Over the next 38 years since its founding, PEC has evolved its offerings to include a continuum of services for homeless families. So emergency shelter services led to the introduction of transitional housing, which is a model of housing that grants families their own front door while still wrapping around a host of social services while they're in housing that's provided by that nonprofit. It doesn't fully make them separate like permanent housing does. It's an interim step. And that transitional housing ultimately led to our construction of more than 150 units of permanent supportive housing in the community, being really permanent apartments where formerly homeless families or families with special needs will move in. So today, while PEC continues to focus its services on homeless families, it's opened its service doors to a larger community, providing employment and training services, GED and literacy classes, basic, intermediate, and advanced computer training to children, youth, and adults. And we've expanded into real estate development activities that go beyond building the housing that accommodate our population to include economic development efforts along Lancaster Avenue in the Mantua-Powelton Village area as well. So I arrived, as I mentioned, just a couple of months ago. And so part of the first series of questions I asked when I arrived to our staff is, how are we defining homeless? And it was a really interesting exercise. So I'm actually going to have the exercise now. I wonder if there'd be a few brave souls who might give me a definition of homeless.
Maybe we can pass around the microphone if anyone's interested in taking up the challenge.
I guess I have more of a picture of it. Certainly it's someone that doesn't have the 4 walls or the front door, and I have a picture of it as someone who I see every day, unfortunately, of either they would be living or sitting, on the streets or sitting in a park, but certainly I would say someone without 4 walls.
That's definitely a definition. Is there another one? I'll take 2 more for interest of time, yeah.
I kind of define it more in terms of having stable, secure housing. So in the same way as if you may not have food that night, you can still be considered hungry. If on a given day you don't have kind of secure housing, I would define that as being homeless.
That's definitely another definition I've heard.
And I would define it as anyone who doesn't have a legal right to a roof over their head, but that they can rely on to make sure that it's there tomorrow.
So the stability of the housing, the permanence of that housing. So those are all ways that we have defined homelessness as a community of providers, but really a lot of what is transpiring at the federal level is the effort to define that, and this is why it matters. So imagine a picture where there's a home, and in that home there's someone standing outside, right? And they're knocking on the door and they want to enter. So scenario A is the door gets opened and someone says, "May I help you?" And the person standing there says, "I need shelter." And the one who's answered the door says, "Come on in, we can give that to you." Scenario B, same person knocking on door. The person who opens the door asks, "How may I help you?" And they say, "I don't have shelter." And the person responds by saying, "Well, can you verify that you're homeless?" And here are a series of questions I'm going to ask you about whether or not you're homeless. And based on whether or not you fit that definition, I can let you in or not, or for how long can I let you in, is dependent on how you answered this question. And what's the difference between those two models? Can anybody guess what the difference between those two models is? Why they're answering the question differently? Why is the person who opened the door answering the question differently to the first person who asked for shelter and the second person who asked for shelter? Why might they be asking it differently?
Because the second person is spending somebody else's money on the shelter.
You got it. You got it. So what's important to understand as we continue into the question and answer period is that originally PEC, when it was doing its work, was really working off of donations and gifts, and it was really new and young in the field of homelessness, providing services to homeless families. As the, and I hate to use the word, but really as the industry has evolved with more federal funding, the federal government really starts to shape the environment and the space within which we work. And therefore, what ends up happening is who we get to serve, to the extent that we are dependent on federal funding to support the work, is really shaped by what's happening at the level that Dennis Culhane is working in, which creates other barriers, which makes it harder to do the work that Nikki had mentioned in terms of being flexible, because the government starts to define how we provide those services.
Thank you for that very interesting perspective. And kind of talking about shelter and talking about this federal commitment to homelessness, despite the renewed federal commitment and federal funding, this year in Philadelphia and in cities around the country, we suffered from a crisis of shelter. Many people believe that addressing the shelter crisis should be the first item on the agenda. Dr. Nunez, you work a lot with shelters. In your view, what role do you see shelters and the services offered at shelters playing in eradicating homelessness in the long term?
You know, this is an area where there's so much debate and there's so much discussion about what is a shelter, what should a shelter do, housing first, so many different answers that people talk about. At the end of the day, one size doesn't fit all. And at the end of the day, reality is, who are homeless families? I'm interested only in the family side, and that's what I'll talk to. When we talk about homelessness, and I hear people definitions, you don't have four walls, this, that, that's true. But you're really talking about poverty. And when you talk about homeless families, you're talking about poverty of people who can't maintain walls for whatever reason. And the answer that homelessness is simply a housing issue is a mistake. Homelessness is much more than that. Your typical homeless mother is a young woman in her 20s with several children who have different fathers. 50% of these mothers haven't completed high school, test at a 6th grade literacy level, employability is a problem. 30% of these young mothers aged out of foster care and became young parents themselves, and they're moving around in a nomadic state. Another 13% we find grew up in shelters themselves as children and are now parents who understand a nomadic way of life. There's no employment history. Domestic violence is 47%. Now that's a lot of poverty issues. And for this particular segment of the population, it's a deep poverty. And maintaining a home becomes extremely difficult. So the role of a shelter is something more than just a temporary way station. And if the truth be told, shelters in the United States today are a surrogate for low-income housing because we build shelters, and we don't build low-income housing, and we probably won't. The deficit now is 6 million low-income renters that have no place to go. And when we talk about numbers and we say there are only 83,000 homeless families in America, We have to talk about the numbers of who are doubled and tripled up, which is why when a shelter empties in the city of New York, it's filled the very next moment, because people are just coming out of these situations that become violent from overcrowding, that become all kinds of stress and strain. So this is much more. So for me, a shelter is something very different. And you know, you can argue about shelters forever, and I think the word shelter is probably a wrong word. People go to school from here, children. People go to work from here. These are places where there's debate today. Housing first will solve the issue. Let's put them in housing and have all those services. Well, these people came from housing, where there were services in the community. It is very difficult, if you really know the poor populations in real poverty, to maneuver community services. You can't ask a young mother, drop your child off at daycare here, get on the bus, get over here for a GED, be over here for employment training in the afternoon. Hey, see your caseworker over here and be sure you get your child on time or we're going to turn him over to child services. I mean, that's how we got into this situation. And the answer that, well, we suddenly have an answer. It's rapid rehousing. We'll put people in housing and we'll solve it. Well, that's fine. For some families, that's true. They are only here and homeless because some crisis appeared. But for a majority, that is not the case. New York City is your prime example. New York has moved to a rapid rehousing policy. It has moved away from managing homelessness. Look, homelessness is here in our lifetime. If you think you're going to go away from here and you're going to solve this and figure it out, you're wrong. If the federal government thinks it's going to put a footprint here and say, we've got it, you're wrong, because homelessness is a local issue. When you talk about federal funding and the way it works and it dictates the environment, it does in a very broad sense. It is local. How you manage your homelessness in Philadelphia is different than how we manage it in New York and how we manage it in Nashville, Fort Worth, anywhere. But when you have families and children involved, you have to take a broader look, and you have to understand that a shelter is where these people are, and a shelter is where they're going to be. So a shelter shouldn't be a shelter. A shelter is, in fact, a community, because what have we done? We've taken away the old communities where people could maintain themselves, perhaps, where at least they knew people and they had structure and supports, and we've put them in new communities, shelters. Shelters have indeed become the new main streets of poverty, of poor communities. So how do you make a shelter work for you? Because I think the answer to ending family homelessness and reducing it is at the door of a shelter. Because that's where it starts. And I think it's a crime to tell a family that comes to a shelter, the first thing we're going to do is focus on your housing. New York City is doing this now and has turned away from this kind of service orientation that has been able to maintain a system at least where the numbers were lower. New York is a good example because it is the capital of family homelessness in the United States. New York moved to a rapid rehousing policy with something called Housing Stability Plus. And we said to families, we're going to give you a voucher. 1 year we'll pay all your rent. That sounds terrific. And we will reduce the homeless numbers. Politically, that is terrific. Public policy point of view, we will see. So what happens in New York, after 1 year, you have to pick up 20% of the rent. After the third year, you will pick up 40%, 50%, and by fifth year, you'll be independent and paying for all your rent. It failed. New York had to abandon it. They moved to a second rapid rehousing policy called Work Advantage. You can work part-time, 20 hours a week. We're going to pay you rent for 2 years. That program's gone. We're now in our third rapid rehousing advantage program based on work again, where we're telling families in 2 years you're going to be independent. We'll pay part of your subsidy and you can do it. Well, you know, some families can, but a majority can't, and that's why the shelters are full. So then the question is, if that's the case, and in New York City, 40% of families that have been through the shelter system are now returning. That number used to be 20% before we started the rapid rehousing policy. Rapid rehousing needs to be looked at, and I only talk about this because it has become the buzzword of the day. I've been in this issue for 25 years on a number of fronts. I ran it in government when it started in New York. I've run it in a nonprofit 25 years, and I've been teaching public policy 32. You put those three hats on, and this is a very different kind of an issue. It isn't simply put someone in an apartment and you've solved it. The difference between what you're seeing here and what you don't see, there are so many families who are on public assistance and supports that aren't out here, it's because we've taken the door off raw poverty. And we see it and we don't like it. And you have children at risk and you need to rethink it. And a shelter needs to move to a new stage. This is the problem. America's standing still. A shelter is no longer just services. A shelter, the third way it's going to go. We've gone from congregate, we've gone to this transitional housing step, now we're going to go to a third tier. A shelter today should be developed as a community resource, as a multi-service community center, where we not only serve homeless families that live in residence there, but we work with the community there, with after-school programs, with daycare, with the health clinic there, with programs for seniors to come who are great role models and mentors for these very young families that need leadership, with GED programs there, with employment programs there, linkages to community colleges, to libraries, to community services. That's how you use a shelter, and that's how you get rid of the word shelter. That is called a community of opportunity. And if we're going to reduce this poverty, now I'm not talking about all the poverty in America, I'm talking about the poverty for people who can't maintain a home or can't earn a decent wage because they don't have the education, which can't give them the opportunity to do that, then you're going to have to rethink what these things are. If we sit here and we keep talking about shelters and we keep talking about housing first and we'll find the answer here and this works and the number's small, the number's big, we'll be doing this for another 30 years. And the situation is worse today than ever before because I tell you, whether you believe it or not, you can come back in 30 years, you'll be here, I'll be dead. But in 30 years, you will not see this large influx of low-income housing that is needed in the United States. In fact, you're seeing it shrink. Every time we take worn-out, high-rise, low-income housing and destroy 3,000 units, we replace it with 300. We create more homelessness. And there is no commitment to do anything in grand, large scale like we did in the 60s and the late 60s because you now have a middle class in America that's being notched down because of the economic situation and will not be notched back up for a long time to come. So not only do you have this problem at the bottom, not only do you have the working poor who are now starting to show up in shelters, and that's something to be fearful of because we don't want to institutionalize that group, but you now have a middle class that's bringing pressure from the top down. And that's where government's going to address first. So we need to rethink what we have. I guess the end statement here is that, look, we have built an enormous infrastructure to deal with this. It is the surrogate for low-income housing in this country for the time being. Should it be permanent? No. Should it be a tool? Yes. Every one of you, when you go out to get your first job, you're going to live doubled up with somebody. In New York, all these young people do. But the more work experience they get, the more education they get, they move from that community setting to the next rung on the ladder. And that's how you have to visualize this from a public policy perspective. When I tell you 40% of the families that have been through the system return to the homeless shelter system in New York City, those are numbers. Now let me tell you about public policy. Those are dollars. If you have a 40% error rate, and in government that's what we would call this, a 40% error rate on a $600 million budget, you're spending an additional $250 million that could be spent smarter, better, productive, and guarantee children their futures. That's where this issue should be focused. That's where you have to think about this. A shelter is not a hostile thing. Unfortunately, it is part of the infrastructure, the social structure. It is a tool. That's all I have to say about that.
Thank you for that very passionate perspective. I think we're all very awake and ready. But I think your comment is well taken. We need to rethink. And Dr. Speedling, Project Home has recently started an initiative to rethink addressing chronic homelessness in the veteran population here in Philadelphia. Do you mind telling us a little bit about this project and what we can learn from this project to address homelessness beyond the veteran population?
Thank you very much, and thank you, Ralph, for letting me go after you. I wish I could have renegotiated the sequence. Anyway, yes, I work at Project Home, and as you may or may not know, we do work on homeless issues across the spectrum, from coordinating the street outreach that's done in the city, to having safe haven, entry-level shelter programs, to having more transitional programs for people with mental illnesses, to permanent supportive housing. And we also do home ownership programs, and we are very, very interested in beginning to work more seriously among our own residents on how we get people into the workforce. And we are making some very serious steps to expand our strategic interests to include health and wellness and education at every level. I'm just going to talk about a pretty small program, but it's quite a good program. And it sort of represents, I think, where Project Home is trying to move with regard to helping people reach a place of self-sufficiency. So let me just say, for many people, and Project Home has a deep, deep history with the chronically homeless population that Dennis referenced. It's sort of our origins. So we are very, very aware that for many people, the journey back from homelessness entails rebuilding the foundation of their lives. in order to reclaim independence and dignity. This is particularly true for those whose lives have been impacted by addictions, mental illness, or both. And we think that employment has a critical role to play in rebuilding this foundation. And at Project Home, as I said, we are redoubling our efforts and rethinking our approaches to how we can assist our residents. And we have over 300 residents people who live in one of our 9 residences. But we want to rethink our approach to how we can help them find meaningful work. By that I mean work that connects with their interests and talents, builds their capacity to engage in civic life, and contributes to their ability to be self-sufficient. Now, People's Emergency Center has really been a little bit of a mentor to us. We had one of your employment people come to talk with us, and we really learned a lot from what you were doing. So Project Home we're a little bit behind, I think, and we need to learn from others. But an example of the work that we're doing is the Veterans Training and Employment Program, which is a partnership between us and Pico Energy, and it's fueled by a grant from the Exelon Foundation. It's a model that uses the restorative power of work, education, and community to help formerly homeless veterans remake their lives. The experience is grounded in the principles of recovery. And the vehicle for accomplishing this change is an internship, a 9-month experience during which the interns hold down real jobs for which they are paid, trained, evaluated. They develop real skills, both hard skills and soft skills, and the program is structured to deepen their recovery and help people get ready to succeed at work and at life. At the end of the internship, the expectation is people will obtain independent employment. It's a small project, but not without significance, because it adds to our learning curve. And after all, Project Home is an acronym. O is opportunities for employment. So it's really important that we become as competent in the employment field as we are in other fields. Now, I'm just going to give you a very, very brief rundown of how this program works. And some of what I'm going to say is not happening now, but because of what we've learned, will happen in the second round. And we're fortunate and grateful to Exelon that we really do have a second round. First of all, immediately after folks are accepted into the program, we do an assessment of work-related experiences, interests, skills, and gaps. This allows us up front to begin to set goals and develop and identify actions that need to be taken during the internship. The interns are matched with participating employers where they receive job assignments, on-the-job training, etc., and they work at their sites for 15 hours a week. They will, in the next round, engage in 18 hours. 3 of those hours will be paid educational hours. Now, I got the warning, so I do want to go right to our learnings. What have we learned from this? We learned 6 things. I may not get to them all. First of all, it's really sounds self-evident, but it's critical. It's critical to help people set goals, real clear and realistic goals. How does work fit into the rest of your life? We have to work with people around their interests and aspirations. We can't be telling them what we think they need to do. Number 2, it is critically important for us to have partners in the corporate sector. And there are many ways for this to happen, through internships, mentoring, giving our residents and clients preferences for interviews, having HR personnel come to speak with us. Internships are a particularly important way to move into the workforce for reasons that we can talk about later, perhaps, but also for Project Home. Given where the economy is at, we recognize the importance of our social enterprises. We have a couple of social enterprises that provide both real employment for people and also training. And so coincident with developing this employment approach, we need to strengthen our own social enterprises. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to fit the rest of it. Thank you.
No, we'll hopefully have a little bit of an opportunity to hear a little more going forward. You mentioned that part of your program needs to set goals and realistic goals. And as you can see from our panelists and the incredible work that they do, I perhaps did not set realistic goals for their time limit. So I'm going to give each panelist kind of an opportunity to perhaps have a 2-minute comment, rebuttal, question option, and then I'll turn it over to the audience for question and answer. And my lovely timer assistant here could hold them to that, hopefully. Whoever would like to begin first is fine.
Would you mind if I go? I just thought, after hearing Dr. Nunez speak, I wanted to underscore a point that he made and maybe just say part of it a little differently. One of the things that also being new at PEC that I did ask too is how do we define success in our work? And ultimately, I think one of the struggles for a lot of homeless services provider is defining that success based on really understanding your own model of providing services. So I think right now for the industry, for those of us who are serving homeless individuals and families, there's a question. Are we really do we have a housing model? And that housing model is probably truer to where Dr. Culhane is with respect to the primary concern that we need to have is making sure that when someone comes into our doors, we're addressing their barriers to housing, we're providing them with a very quick road into permanent housing, and then moving on. So success is when they get to shelter, well, permanent housing, I should say. The other model, which I think is probably speaks more to groups like the People's Emergency Center, is a recovery model, which is really, the shelter is an open environment which allows our case managers and our residential staff to be more involved in the lives of the families that we're serving and really ask them to set goals for themselves, to address parenting and employment skills that are needed, maybe get their GED, start to get them on a road that once they get into that permanent housing, they have a higher level of likelihood of success. And so part of what we're doing at our organization is starting to develop a typology which will help us understand who's going to best benefit for our services, particularly because I think we tend to view ourselves more as the recovery model. And just a quick additional statement. It is really, really important for you to hear that a lot of the families that we are now seeing in shelter tend to be young women who have aged out of foster care or who have grown up in public housing, and because now they have children, they now have to move out because they violate the rule in terms of number of individuals living in the home. And so they find themselves in shelter, but in reality haven't really been given a good model of parenting or any model of parenting. And so part of the work that we're really focusing on too is teaching the parenting skills, because our belief and our hope is that if we have really strong women who are strong parents and really know how to nurture their children, that we're hoping that that bond that they didn't get themselves will help provide their children with a brighter future.
Just before the next speaker goes, if you guys start thinking of questions, if you can write them on the cards, that would be great, and pass them down. Otherwise, we'll also take questions orally once they finish.
Okay, so I'd like to ask Dennis. Dennis mentioned that there are about 150,000 chronically homeless singles in the country, and that there's no question in my mind that we have made a lot of progress in learning how to address their needs and to help people get off the street. But Dennis, that the number isn't static. I mean, so there's kind of a continuing flow of people into that deplorable condition of chronic street homelessness. What do you think has to happen to kind of slow down the pipeline into that condition?
So the number is actually 115,000.
Sorry.
And that number was at 180,000 6 years ago. So there's been about a 1/3 decline in the chronic homeless population. Represents about 70,000 fewer individuals, which is consistent with the fact that about 85,000 units of housing were developed. So it passes a sniff test, if you will, that you develop those housing units targeted to them, you should see an impact. So Chronic homelessness is accrued over a period of time, so it would not be the case that, that it has a replacement rate consistent with the same. It depends on the pace of what we're doing with regard to exits, but there is, of course, some level of replacement. What any community needs to have, we know there's about 10 to 15% turnover in those units per year. So if you want to be able to accommodate all the new cases of chronic homelessness, you need to have a supply such that 15% of the year of turnover can handle the inflow, so to speak. And so that's essentially, I think in Philadelphia, we estimated that number to be 4,000 units. That would 4,000 units would generate about 500 vacancies a year. And we have about 800 chronically homeless individuals in Philadelphia. So if we got to 4,000 of those units, you could probably conceivably, make a substantial inroad there. So that's essentially it, the idea. We're at about 2,000 units, by the way. Philadelphia has about 2,000 of those units.
Did any of the other panelists want to comment before we move to questions?
No, you have something else.
Well, I really don't. Not all, but enough.
I mean, what I would say, sort of having been on the other end of it, is when you're homeless, it's hard to think long term. You literally are you're thinking hour by hour, day by day. You're just trying to get through that day. Am I going to have a place to live tonight? Am I going to have food for lunch? Am I going to have food for dinner? I think you're sort of both right when you're talking about the housing model. I mean, I think you absolutely have to have a place to live and know that you're going to have it for a set period of time. But I really do agree with Dr. Nunez, is that you really do have to deal with the poverty issues that are underlying it, because that's one of the reasons my brother ended up being chronically homeless, is he aged out of the foster care system and he can never sort of get back on his feet because you don't have the resources, you don't have the family, you don't have anybody you can call for money at a certain point, and you just can't get to where you need to be. And when people ask me about my family, I say to a certain extent, my mom didn't know how to live like a normal person, like what we all think of as being a normal person, not having a bank account, and she finished high school, but the getting up and going to work on a day-to-day basis was very, very difficult for her, and that's something that got passed on to my brother. He saw that. And so I think you have to be able to deal with those underlying issues, or you're not going to have people who are self-sufficient at a certain point. And for me, I want to have the conversation, not just that people are living in housing, but I want other people to have the opportunities that I've had, which is to move up and become middle class. And that's a hard leap to make, and you can't do it by yourself. But the truth is, you're going to pay for these kids now, or you're going to pay for them later. And the money that was invested in me, since I've hit 18 years old, I've always worked. I've never, other than my student loans, I've never had any kind of handout. I've never been on welfare, but that's unusual. And I think you have to work with where people are. And the truth is, when you're having this kind of conversation, the government, a lot of people are not willing to give money for this because they think they get up and they go to work every single day, so why should they have to give money for this? So they're only willing to give it in the short term, and we really do have to think about long term. That's a long life for people, it really is.
Maybe I do have something to add.
I knew it.
Only in just listening to all of this, to put it into a kind of a context that picks up a little bit of what everybody said. What we're talking about here, I tell you there's such a deficit in low-income housing. So the issue is the scarcity of the housing we get, we must have from a business model. I mean, from a business perspective, this is pretty plain. We must have product. And the product must be good product. It must be a product that can maintain itself. You wouldn't buy a car that comes without wheels. You wouldn't buy a car that comes with wheels that don't last more than a couple weeks. So when we talk about this, and the program sense of what you're saying here is, look, we're talking about producing product. When I tell you that you have to think of this in a new way, that you have to think of shelters no longer as shelters, but as almost machines that are going to take people from some of the problems they have so they can get up on time, so that they do know what it is to go to work, so that they do meet these challenges, we're talking about producing product. And the most important thing that woke me up over here is this idea about an upfront cost. It is argued all the time, shelter costs a lot of money. A shelter could be $30,000 a year. I saw in US Today, it could be anywhere from $20,000 to $30,000. People say, that's horrendous. Well, let me tell you, a prison costs $40,000 a year. Juvenile justice system's $40,000. Foster care is up to $50,000. A single shelter for a mother who you split a family up is $20,000, and then the 2 children in foster care is $120,000. And it gets better. People say to me all the time, it's so expensive, it's so expensive. What's the alternative? There is no housing. What's the alternative? Give somebody a temporary subsidy and see them again, or the family breaks up? Well, there are alternatives. Yes, there are. They're foster care, they're jail, juvenile justice, mental health institutions. We are at a critical point in this country where policy decisions must be based not on wishes to reduce numbers. This has become a country of numbers. The welfare rolls are tremendously down, yes. And every other role, prison rolls, shelter rolls, foster care rolls are tremendously up. We have to rethink what we're doing, and we just can't throw money at it. We must do it in a cost-effective way. We must produce the products so that when we go to that scarce resource called a home, we can turn our back on that family. And I'm not talking about eliminating poverty. We will never do that. It's been here since ancient Rome. But can we reduce these issues so that a family can manage themselves? When I tell you a mother has a 6th grade literacy level, at the key of all of this was mentioned, it is education. If you want to reduce homelessness in America, education. Educate the parent, educate the teenager, teen pregnancy, educate the young kids so they have an opportunity to participate in the American dream. Okay?
Actually, so I had to respond to a question, so if
Go
I could
ahead,
actually
yes.
make my comment. So I guess I would say a few things. One is it's very important for us not to confound homelessness and poverty. You know, there's been a lot of research done that's looked at homeless families and to other housed but equally poor families in the same situation, and they aren't any different. If indeed homeless families were a distinct population that was poor apart, yes, poor families come with many needs. Foster care history, domestic violence, 50% of poor women experience domestic violence. No different, homeless or housed. Same rates of mental illness, same rates of substance abuse, same rates of public assisted receipt. Homeless families are not a poor apart. If indeed they were, then the rationale that we should create specific facilities for them might have some resonance. But the fact is, they are no different. The average length of stay in family homelessness across the country, and we have a national issue here, not just a local issue, is 30 days. So, you know, most families are resolving their homelessness experiences relatively quickly, and that's a good thing. The second point I would want to make is that, you know, a lot of things have been said, a lot of statistics were argued, but I think what's important is to understand that there's a difference between ideology and social science. And there's a difference between, you know, a program level perspective versus what research shows us. And we've had a debate in this country for 20 years with regard to homelessness. We've had research done, and there is a consensus. That consensus is represented in this new federal legislation, whether you like it or not. The social science community is in agreement that rapid rehousing and getting families into housing as quickly as possible is the least destructive thing for them. There is also agreement that the shelters are expensive, they're inefficient forms of subsidized housing. The families vote with their feet and leave as soon as they can, when they can, and they don't want to live under someone's program. It's not healthy for families to live in someone's program. We had families for millennia, for as long as humans have been around, and they did very well without homeless programs. So we don't need to defend homeless programs, and we will not end homelessness without ending homeless programs, unfortunately. So, you know, I think it's important to understand that, you know, not all policy choices are equal. As Dr. Nunez said, you know, shelter is very expensive. On an annual basis in New York City, it's $50,000 to $60,000 a year for a family to be in shelter. That same cost could provide 5 years of a federal housing subsidy for that family. So, you know, this debate has been had in the academic literature. It's been had in the Congress. There was testimony. We had Republicans and Democrats consider legislation. We had the Obama administration represent an opinion. We had professional advocates who debated this issue, and what won the day was not the perspective that Dr. Nunez is representing. What won the day was the perspective that families should be placed in housing as soon as possible. No one should be homeless more than 30 days, and that should be our national goal. And whatever the resources are that it takes, if a family can get out with 6-month subsidy, 18-month subsidy, 2 years subsidy, or even if they need 5 years subsidy, that's what we should provide. The fact that some families fail, that means we're not providing enough subsidy. But that doesn't mean we should lock them into homeless programs for 2 years at a cost of $120,000 a family, when they are no different than the other poor families who are not homeless. So I'll leave it at that.
One of our audience members seems to agree with you. She or he says that it seems like rapid rehousing makes sense. So this audience member wanted to know, can you, for those of you who are saying that rapid rehousing has not been successful, can you talk about why it's been a failure and what is causing it to fail? I guess this was directed at Dr. Nunez, if he would like to start.
You know, I'm sorry, but I was thinking. Can you say that again?
Yes. So I'll read it directly. It says, Dr. Nunez talked about how the rapid rehousing program was a failure. Can you talk about why it's been such a failure?
Okay.
What is a...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No,
That's it? Okay. I'm not saying it's a failure. I'm saying it's untested, and it's being tested now. And in New York, the early tests are a failure, and it'll have to be tested in a lot of places. I think also the issue, when people talk about research, and they say, well, the research shows. Well, let me tell you what the research doesn't show. Homes for the Homeless has housed over 38,000 families and over 70,000 kids. I have seen families that should never be in a shelter. It's a quirk. They didn't pay the rent. Instead, they paid a medical bill and they're here. And you can move them out. You can, and you should give them supports and everything else. But I have seen far, far, far more on the ground of families that have children at risk. And if you put them back behind a door, yes, they may stay there for a while, but that family is at risk, and that child will be at risk for child welfare, and that parent's at risk of domestic violence and everything else. I have firmly come to believe, and people talk about the literature. The problem with literature, being an academic myself, is that we write to each other, right? And then we go to a conference and we read to each other, and then we applaud each other. And there is a place for that, and I've done that. Far less these days than I've done in the past. But I have focused on the risk of children and on the cost associated with children. And yes, the term, no child should live in a shelter, is very true. And that's why I tell you, no shelter should be a shelter. It is low-income housing. And to artificially put a 30-day target, I mean, this is, you know, think about, I'm a political scientist, so I can do this piece, okay? Government makes decisions for a lot of reasons. And I can tell you that non-decisions are just as important as decisions. And I can tell you, when it comes to homelessness, having been at the very top of New York City government to deal with this issue, that we made many decisions because we wanted it to look better. We make many decisions because for the years we are here in power, we need to manage this issue. When you hear about, and this isn't to knock this, I'm now putting out what I think are the issues for people to pay attention to. When we talk about new policy and things, do you know 15 years ago the big thing was a 10-year plan? Everyone needed a 10-year plan. So now it's 15 years later, it's 10 years later, a kid that was 9 is 20, a parent that was 20 is 30, and 10-year plans are going on. We're beyond it. New York City had a 5-year plan. That went away, gone. What I'm saying is, politics dictates an awful lot when we make policy here. And I say again, this great rush to the bottom of 30 days will solve homelessness is a miracle. We will have to see. So here I will put the academic hat on and say, let's see the research. Talk to me. In New York City, we're already 6 years into a rapid rehousing policy. 6 years of failure. It's changed 3 times, and now the state of New York has turned around and said, we're not funding this. And the city of New York is now in a fight with the state about a housing subsidy. I do firmly believe, regardless of what the literature is and who everybody in Washington thinks, that an upfront cost on poverty is a good bang for your dollar. And I will go as far to say, for the poorest of the poor who are in shelters, shelters have become the front line of what is left of the war on poverty in America. And there isn't that much of it left anymore. And by the time we're done with what's happening in Washington and the states today, there'll be far less. So if you want to see more poverty in front of you, just believe that this is just a 30-day wonder. Okay?
If I may, excuse me, if I may.
Yes.
I'm not the academic here. I'm just a tax lawyer. But I think what we're missing here when you guys are arguing about the theories, and I don't understand all of the theories, all I know is that when people come and they need help, they don't care about what the program's called. They just care that they have housing and that they have a better life for themselves and their children. So I think that you're both right. And I think that it's going to take a combination of a lot of different models to make it work, because different people have different needs. But I don't really want, I feel like we're getting into a dual theory that's going on. And you know what? When you're homeless, you don't care about theory. The only theory is you don't have a place to live.
Yeah, and I think that's an unbelievably important point to make. I would answer that question by saying rapid rehousing works, but not for everyone. Recovery model shelter works, but not for everyone. That's the crux of the debate that you're seeing here, I think, is really speaking to that earlier point about the fact is that the brunt of the resources that are available to do this work comes from the federal government. So the debates happen at a level where many providers aren't necessarily involved in that conversation. The federal government is defining how we are supposed to do the work locally, and we are desperate for the funds. So we as providers either debate back and scream and shout or adjust. At the end of the day, we're trying to solve problems for people who are impoverished, who are looking for people who can help them. I and our organization wishes to focus on that. We'll allow these people to continue the debate, but we'll be party to it because ultimately we want as many resources as are possible to support the model that we believe works for the population we serve.
Okay, so if I could just respond, because everyone else has had a chance to respond to that.
I'm going to ask that we
do not have,
table this, please. I know this is a debate that we could all stay here for the rest of the time. I do want to try and get to a couple other questions. Yes.
Hi, I'm so excited about what we're discussing. I just want to add some more complexity to it, and I really want to. I really want to draw your attention to, I don't really know what the right word is. In Children's Health Watch, we call it invisible homelessness. I guarantee you there are hundreds of thousands more families that you are not touching and not counting that are homeless, couch surfing, living in abandoned homes, and living in their own homes in which they may have grown up without running water and without electricity. And it's happening right here in Philadelphia. And I think so. You think a lot about the families that are couch surfing that would not dare enter the system of homelessness. At least in Philadelphia, that's what we know. And let's draw attention to the Office of Supportive Housing, which is a disgusting place to go for a family when they have to land in Eliza Shirley, which is bedbug infested, and where people are so desperate and are high, you're not going to get half of the families that really deserve, and I mean, all of the families deserve homes, but you're not going to get the families that you want to reach because they wouldn't dare enter the quote, homelessness system, of entering the shelter system. And we cannot get hundreds of families help in this city because we can't officially they don't officially want to be homeless. So they continue to route around while their children are at major risk. So why isn't there no discussion of the slumlords and what we're doing about them? Why is there no discussion of Section 8 and housing choice? And the fact that Section 8 has been closed for years and opens, wonderfully for a whopping 2 weeks in 2010. And why is there no discussion of the absolutely rancid situation with Philadelphia, the Public Housing Authority? Let's talk about those kinds of issues that are driving the homelessness problem and the invisible homelessness problem. Finally, I would like someone to talk more about domestic violence prevention. Not just domestic violence prevention, but intimate partner violence prevention, child abuse and neglect, and how those kinds of prevention programs can actually help to stem the tide of homelessness. However you want to define it, whether it's invisible or visible, whether you're in office supportive housing, private home, everywhere. That violence has not gotten its due in this situation.
Okay, I need to
You are not lying. You definitely added several layers of complexity. I'm going to briefly allow the panelists to respond, and then I have a question from the card that someone sent up that we'll answer, and that will probably be close to the end.
Yes, I just want to go back to my point I was making earlier, is we don't want to confound homelessness and poverty. The issues you're describing are poverty. We need to solve poverty on its own merits. We will not solve poverty by putting people in homeless shelters and by having better programs in homeless shelters. As you said, homeless shelters touch only a small percentage of the problem. If we're really concerned about these problems of children coming out of foster care with their kids, about domestic violence, about the inadequacies of housing and utilities, we have to solve those problems. Those problems are not going to be solved by putting all these resources into the emergency shelter system. Furthermore, as you said, many people are in this invisible, hidden homeless category. Those are exactly the people who are targeted for the homelessness prevention and some of the rapid rehousing programs. You do not have to be homeless to be eligible for the new federal homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing program. That was the whole intent of the program, was to move our intervention up sooner so that people don't have to end up in the homeless system. If they do end up homeless, we help them get out, but we have to first do everything we can to help people avoid it, and we have to create support for people who are having housing problems to solve their housing problems without having to declare themselves as homeless. So how we structure the emergency assistance system is very important. And a system that's very inequitable, that spends very large sums of money on very small numbers of people, while many, many more people get nothing, is inequitable, it's unfair, and it's not a good use of society's resources. And there is research that shows that transitional housing programs, of what we've heard, are not effective. There is no results there's no research to show that these transitional housing programs do better than families who are placed into permanent housing on their own. There is no data to show that. The argument that the rapid rehousing programs have 40% recidivism rate in New York City, that includes also all the people who didn't get into those programs. So that's not the accurate statistics regarding what is the recidivism rate of people who are coming out of rapid rehousing. That's everybody who exits a New York City shelter, 50% of whom leave with no rapid rehousing assistance. So I think it's really important, you're entitled to your opinion, you're not entitled to your own facts. There is research, there's important statistics, there are verifiable things, and there are issues of equity and efficiency here, and that's what public policy is about. We have to not only try to help people, we have to do it as efficiently and effectively as possible, not just because someone believes that what they're doing is the right thing, but because we actually have evidence to tell us that it works.
I just want to briefly just make a remark on the question or the statement. I think that what you said is enormously important. And I think that I see the need for a great deal more advocacy among people in addition to people like us. And I just want to commend you for having this program, because we need public interest lawyers. We need engaged people all over this city, because those issues are really destroying the fabric of the city. So I commend you, and I know that you have shouted this and said this in many, many fora, and I really commend you for that. We need to get more than just us. We don't own this problem, and we definitely don't own the solution. We need you to be as fired up as you are.
And I think that brings us back to kind of the theme of the entire symposium, is this idea that we need to collaborate. It cannot just be lawyers, but it needs to be direct service providers, policymakers, and everyday citizens involved in this problem. And one of these questions really draws on this idea of collaboration, and it's reflecting on the panel that we had in the morning on life after conviction. And this is directed at Ms. Jimenez and Dr. Speedling. So this question says, what suggestions do you have for people with criminal records in Philadelphia who can't be in federally funded subsidized housing? How big is a waiting list for your supportive housing? Do you screen for criminal records?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because we're struggling with that not just as a provider, but also, frankly, as an employer. and evaluating whether or not we want to have the box on our application for employment. And part of the reason that we're have that questioning is, what's interesting is a lot of times for women, their criminal record usually takes the form of a summary offense because they were shoplifting. And that can be enough of a prevention for them to get not just jobs, but access to federally funded affordable housing. So right now what we're doing is providing an expungement clinic on a monthly basis. So we're helping people as much as possible clear their records. The other is we're, again, evaluating our own box. And unfortunately, like I said earlier, the federal government makes its own decisions, and we're forced to live with those decisions. So I'm not sure how much we're going to be able to change that because, as probably some of you know, a lot of that movement towards preventing people access to that housing came around during the crack epidemic and the war on drugs. And so it's really a reflection of that policy. So we're trying, at least on a one-off basis, to try and make a bit of a difference.
Yeah, I couldn't really speak with any specificity about that, except that we do an awful lot of advocacy around these issues, but I really don't know specifically how to address the specifics of the question.
And just one final question to kind of draw this panel to a close and the symposium to the close is, we've talked a lot about the differences between you guys as panelists, but we've also talked about the need to address a wide variety of issues when we're talking about homelessness. So I guess just to end, and if maybe in a minute or two, if you can just discuss which areas or initiatives do you think are ripe for collaboration, perhaps amongst yourselves or amongst other practitioners?
Well, for us, I think that we are beginning to reach out to other organizations to try to create a coalition to work on job development and aggregating resources and competencies so each of us doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. We really need, I think, to be more collaborative than we've been in the past.
We actually have a program we've run for several years called the Family Services Provider Network that Joe Willard here, who's our Vice President of Policy, has spearheaded and facilitated for several years. And it's a coalition of the different providers that work with homeless families around policy and advocacy, but also professional development for those in the field, things like de-escalation and other kinds of training. And then the other ways that we partner is, any day that you come to PEC, you'll see a multiplicity of partnerships, whether it be the National Lawyers Guild that's doing the expungement clinic, or CHOP that comes out and does health care, or the Health Management Corporation that actually has an in-house practitioner that comes and provides services. That's what we're in the business of doing, which is pulling together as many resources as we can, because we can't do it all, and we're not going to be good at everything. So we partner as much as possible in order to introduce our families to services they wouldn't otherwise be aware of.
Professor Culhane, I know you say we can't, conflate poverty and homelessness, but do you see within the field of homelessness reasons and opportunities to collaborate?
Well, I think that the primary objective is that we have to make the anti-poverty system that we have in this country, the public assistance programs, the mental health programs, the criminal justice system programs, all of these things have to be made to work so that people don't become homeless. Because what we've done for the last 25 years is recreate the social welfare system inside the homeless system, as though these some are unique individuals. And we've given a reason for all of these public agencies to not own the responsibility they have to making sure that their clients are appropriately housed, that they're getting the assistance they need to stay stably housed, and they've been able to foist it off to the homeless system. And so we have got to push back and say that, no, the homeless system is not the destination for all the cast off of these agencies, and we have to switch our advocacy from trying to grow a larger homeless system to making the mainstream social welfare systems do their job more effectively. That is the anti-poverty advocacy that we need to do, not to grow a bigger and better homeless system. which at the end of the day will only have more homeless people?
Dr. Nunez, Ms. Johnson-Houston.
I think probably the key area for any kind of collaboration is education. I think it's education around shelters that do exist, shelters that people live in. And I think linking community colleges, I think bringing college students there, I think linking libraries, bringing those kind of programs, and making a shelter a residential, educational, multi-service stay has enormous benefit. And if there's any kind of collaboration that should exist, it's around education.
I would agree. Education has given me every single opportunity I've had in life. I started a mentoring program for inner city kids that are interested in becoming lawyers. I go out and speak at homeless shelters, at schools, and I want people to see that this is a face of homelessness, and this is also a face of opportunity. So for me, part of it, like I said, I'm not an academic. It's also about being in the room and saying, let's not forget the people while we're having these academic discussions, because it's different when you've been there.
Thank you all for your thoughtful commentary. Can we please give them a round of applause? Before you guys all leave, Valerie Barron is just going to give some closing remarks, and then I'm sure some of you would like to speak with the panelists, and they'll be available for that afterwards.
Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for sticking with us through a fascinating day. As we close, and I do ask your permission to take one more brief moment of your time, I just want to reflect a little bit. Those of us who planned this symposium began by thinking about some of the core issues that faced public interest lawyers and their clients 30 years ago when this symposium tradition began here at Penn Law. We found that many of these issues persist, and that the profession continues to respond and innovate with new, creative, and collaborative solutions. In today's discussions, we've hoped to honor this work and to celebrate these existing and expanding collaborations. The symposium itself is a collaboration. It's a collaboration between many people. It's a collaboration between the Journal of Law and Social Change and the Toll Public Interest Scholars. On behalf of the Journal of Law and Social Change, which will be publishing a symposium edition in the near future, with contributions from many of our panelists, and the Toll Public Interest Scholars, I want to thank you, the panelists, the audience, and the volunteers for making this day possible. In addition, we want to thank the Toll Public Interest Center Student Advisory Board. Infinite thanks to the Toll Public Interest Center staff, Lauren, Emily, Tori, Arlene, thank you. We want to thank Dean Fitz and the Law School Administration. We want to thank Ada Carlson and Evan Hene, the Penn Homeless Advocates, who were instrumental, along with other student pro bono projects, for inviting Sister Mary Scullion, co-founder and executive director and president of Project Home, to speak at the reception, which will take place downstairs in just a minute when I let you all get out of here. She'll be speaking at 5:30, and we encourage you all to join us downstairs for a reception and to hear her remarks. So in short, thank you.